evening, everyone. I'm going to start. My name is Gonzalo Rivero. I'm an SJD here at Harvard Law School. It's a pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Abukhalil, who teaches political science at California State University Stanislaus and at Berkeley. Professor Abukhalil was born in Lebanon and obtained degrees from the American University of Beirut and Georgetown. He's the author of Bin Laden, Islam and America's New War on Terrorism, published in 2002, and The Battle for Saudi Arabia, published in 2004. He maintains a very popular blog, the Angry Arab News Service. And his talk today is about Obama's Middle East policies, the persistence of the Bush Doctrine. And let me just say on behalf of Justice for Palestine, to thank the co-sponsors, the Middle East Law Students Association and the Islamic Legal Studies Program.
Thank you very much. I will be speaking for 40 minutes and then we will open it up for your participation in agreement or disagreements. To speak about a comparison of the Bush and Obama doctrine may imply a certain accusations of unfairness. I mean, it is true that we are trying to compare and contrast a record of the Bush administration that spanned over 8 long years, and then we are comparing that to an administration that has just begun. But I think that we have enough material in terms of rhetoric as well as in terms of policies and wars to work with. And if there are going to be contrasting, contradictory indications, I think it would be necessary for some to adjust one's critique of the Obama doctrine. I mean, I think when we speak first about the Bush doctrine, we have to decide on whether to define that doctrine in terms of its own actual rhetoric, its own promises and declarations, or do we judge it in terms of its actual record, measured by the number of people dead. Not only Americans, because these are the only ones who are counted in US media, but also the number of people dead in the various countries where the Bush doctrine has projected its power. And that would be places like Sudan, places like Somalia, Northern Africa, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. It seems to me we have to engage in a critique of the Bush doctrine simultaneously, of the doctrine or of the actual record. Just like there's an article by Sayla bin Habib about Hegel's philosophy in the book Feminist Interpretation of Hegel. And she was arguing, how do we study Hegel, or how do we critique Hegel? Do we critique Hegel in terms of his own philosophy, what Adorno called immanent critique, the system itself, the extent to which it coheres or does not cohere, or do we critique that philosophy from outside by the standards of justice, liberty, or equality, the one that we champion today? And she argues that most people tend to go for one or the other, and she suggested a double vision approach. So it seems to me that's what I think we should do in terms of the American foreign policy doctrines, whether it's Bush or Obama. Now, to measure the declared Bush doctrine, I think it will be necessary to refer to the National Security Strategy for the United States, which was issued in September 2002, largely the work of Stephen Hadley and Condoleezza Rice. So we can identify certain measures that are of relevance to us in terms of critiquing the doctrine as far as the Middle East region is concerned. The first item of that doctrine is preemptive war. And it's very important when we study the preemptive war doctrine to compare that to Israeli policies, to see the extent to which Israel, as an aggressor regional state, has presented a model of world aggression for the United States after September 11. Now, it is said that George W. Bush, in fact, read the book by Michael Oren on 6 Days of War about the 1967 war. Without arguing whether Bush actually read the book or not, because it is debatable given the man's record and command of the language, it is important to see certain resemblances. I mean, in 6 Days of War, we know, I mean, despite the flaws of the book, which are too numerous for me to get into right now, and it's definitely a one-sided account of that war based on one side and not what the jacket cover promises based on both sides. I mean, he doesn't know Arabic to judge. I can say that the preemptive war of Israel, as it calls itself, was based like the American invasion of Iraq on false premises. I mean, Israel had to doctor an evidence to use as a pretext for war. I mean, we now know, for example, a multitude of lies that Israel engaged in order to justify its aggression against a multitude of states. For example, they convinced Western audiences, and I would say to this very day, that Arab leaders promised or threatened to throw Israel into the sea. In fact, I mean, I bothered to check the record from those years. There is absolutely no evidence to that whatsoever. This was clearly concocted by Israel in order to sway public opinion in the West in order to do what Israeli propaganda has always done, to conflate Palestinian Arab resistance and opposition to Israel with that of Nazi Germany. And in fact, I was talking to the author of the best biography of Hajj Amin al-Husseini, Philip Matar, and he did not whitewash the record of that lousy Palestinian leader. I mean, and I was telling him, I mean, isn't it amazing that there are something like 8, 9, you were with me, Hisham, there are 8, 9 books about Hajj Amin's meetings with Hitler. I mean, first of all, there was one sole meeting with Hitler, and of course, I am against any meeting with Hitler for any number of times. But to make of one meeting with Hitler, not two, as now they say, to make it an alliance between Palestinian leadership and to basically invent the notion that Hajj Amin knew Adolf Eichmann when there is no record whatsoever of that, except some propaganda statement from the 1940s which alleged that one person in the camp said he saw somebody who looked like Hajj Amin shaking hands with, I mean, that's how absurd and flimsy the evidence that is used. Thirdly, as you probably do not remember, but know if you read William Quant's account, because he was on the National Security Council at the time, Israel, in the first few hours of the war, claimed to the United States that Egypt struck first, because the United States was saying Israel will be alone if it goes alone. And the United States, by Lyndon Johnson administration, was saying that no party should be the first to strike, but Israel struck first. But to avoid any American retributions, it thought it was coming. It claimed that Egypt, in fact, was the one that struck first, but of course, the lie was too flat that it was abandoned. But if you go to the record of 67, the first hours, that's what they said in the beginning. So the first one, the preemptive war, we see similarity of creating flimsy evidence to convince the world, to sway public opinion, and this is something that was embedded in the book by Michael Oren. And of course, you will notice if you read that book, he in fact did cite an official Israeli Air Force statement which said we want to push the Arabs into the desert. So the threatening of moving an entire population to the sea or the desert was in fact not uttered by Arab leaders but by Israeli leaders in an official Air Force statement. Second, the Bush Doctrine promised a freedom agenda, which is the spread of liberty in the Middle East and democracy. 3, a war on terror of unknown duration, of ill-defined enemy, of undetermined scope. 4, the promise of a Palestinian state, the first promise of its kind ever to come out of an American president. However, if you read the new book, which I just finished on the plane, by David Ottaway, the national security correspondent of the Washington Post, about Saudi-American relations, that promise did not come in response to Palestinian national aspirations or to pleas by Arabs, but it was intended to smooth America's relationship with the most oppressive state, perhaps on the face of the earth, and I'm talking about Saudi Arabia. 5, the Bush Doctrine promised a benign attitude and in fact a favorable attitude to Islam, that Islam is not the enemy. That was the rhetoric. And 6, unconditional support of Israel as a Jewish state. Now this is a new element that Israel is now invoking, which is that to support Israel not in its borders or not in an expansive state, but in its as a Jewish state. An unusual promise or policy. In fact, there was something similar to that in the 1920s and 30s. There were some Maronite leaders in Lebanon who asked the French to make Lebanon a Christian state. And the Maronites, by the census of 1936, were supposed to be the majority. And even the French colonial powers did not think that was quite worthwhile.